welcome to Sociology of Sexualities. I'm Tina Fetner, and this is the optional supplementary material for Module 7, School, Work, and Sexuality. First thing that we're going to talk about is schools and social control. If you're a traditional age university student, you should be an expert in this area, having come from your high schools very recently and experience subject to social control of sexuality. And so I'd like you to reflect on how accurate, or inaccurate my depiction of schools and social control might be. One of the things that we focus on when we're talking about schools and social control is the concept of heteronormativity. And if this is a word that isn't familiar to you, you can kind of break it apart and see that we're talking about the sort of ways that heterosexuality is embedded in social norms, right? So we've already talked about heterosexuality as a social institution, set of rules governing social behavior of large numbers of people. Heteronormativity similarly guides behaviors of lots of people. This is the idea that heterosexuality receives a greater amount of social approval, is more widely accepted, and sets the norm as what we're all expected to behave, or what we all kind of deviate from or differ from. So if we understand heteronormativity as a social institution, we can understand it as intersecting with other social institutions, in this case, schools, right? So the question becomes, how much does school culture rely on the presumption that everyone, all the students, all the teachers, all the administrators, and just the larger world that we're engaging with, is organized around heterosexuality, right? It wasn't that long ago that this was 100% the case, right? So when I was going to school, for example, everybody was presumed to be heterosexual. The entire curriculum was organized around kind of the idea of that normal people were organized in nuclear families, that mothers, did one kind of work and fathers did a different kind of work, and heterosexuality was kind of embedded into the curriculum very deeply. Some sociologists that have researched this topic find that even still today, a presumption of heterosexuality is still embedded in the curriculum, despite the social changes that have increased inclusivity of LGBTQ people. So this is an open question of how much this might have changed recently, and I think that the best answer we can give at this point is that some schools might have changed a lot, but a lot of schools probably have changed very little. And so there's a wide variation of this embeddedness of heteronormativity in education today. I'm going to return back to our old original concept of sexual hierarchies, looked at through the reflection of schools and schooling. To what extent do schools sort of communicate a sexual hierarchy and in fact even enforce sexual hierarchies, right? Do schools play an important role in helping us understand that some sexual behaviors are better or more appropriate or more valuable than other kinds of sexual behaviors? I think that it's pretty clear that they do. You can look at sex education curriculums, for example, to see evidence of sexual hierarchies, but I think that it also shows up in the curriculum elsewhere. This is true of lots of different hierarchies as well. Gender hierarchies might be hierarchies that the schools enforced, and also racial hierarchies. So I think it's important for us to understand and reflect on our own school experience and think about the ways that that gender, race, and sexuality were all communicated to us as being sort of located as better or worse, or more valuable to less valuable, depending on where you are on this hierarchy. One of the things that's come up lately is the question about whether these kinds of social hierarchies around gender, sexuality are reflected in how students are treated, right? So questions around sexual harassment of girls, racial harassment of visible minorities, or bullying of LGBT students, it has been an important question that researchers have turned their attention to in the last decade. In Ontario, we have some, in Canada, we have some data that school teachers have collected looking at whether bullying exists and if so, to what extent. Right, so in the chart that you're looking at now, it pulls out the different provinces or different colors, right? And the first set of columns there are lesbian, gay, and bisexual students, and the second set of colors there are transgender students. And these are charts that report questions about how safe people feel, right? And so questions about, do you feel safe in your school? If you're an LGB student in BC, 3/4 of you, or 76%, are likely to say that you feel safe. But if you're a transgender student, only 50%, 52% are likely to say that they're feeling safe in school. And so these perceptions of safety are related to experiences of bullying, harassment, and violence. And so the question is an open one about how well schools are able to protect students who are LGBT. Does everything get better when you get to universities? Maybe, maybe not. Sexual culture of university is a question that is also captured the attention of sociology of sexuality researchers. I'd like to look at things like sexual assault in the university, the safety of LGBT students and of women, and the sort of prevalence of hierarchies of sexuality and gender. But another topic that I want to talk to you about in university is the way that there are particular sexual cultures in universities and how they might be changing over time. Right, so sociologists have defined the current sexual culture that dominates university systems as a hookup-based culture. Now, you might be quite familiar with hookup culture, but you should know that it's different from the sexual culture of, say, 20 or 30 years ago, where dating and what we call serial monogamy kind of was the norm, the rule, the dominant culture of universities. So you date one person for a while, and then you'd break up with them, and then you date somebody else for a while. So you have monogamy in short bursts, one after the other. That's what we mean by serial monogamy. In hookup culture, things are different. We're talking about sex without that kind of dating relationship. That is kind of casual and less sort of with less emotional investment. One of the things that's curious, and it might be different from what you've heard about through like newspapers or social media, that this new hookup culture that prefers sort of non-relationship based sexuality over kind of dating sexuality has not produced an increase in the overall amount of sex that university students are having. What we're talking about when we're talking about hookup culture then is the way that the culture kind of dominates the rules of the game, the social norms that govern how students organize their sexuality. And this is true, this culture exists, it's here, it's kind of permeating the expectations of a university sex culture, regardless of whether or not any individual student participates in hookups, in hooking up or not. It's kind of the rules of the game. It's a very open question about whether this new kind of hookup culture is more safe for women students than the previous kind of serial monogamy approach. From what we are learning, it seems that women students weren't safe 50 years ago, they're not safe 30 years ago, and they certainly aren't safe in hookup culture today. The best statistics that we have show that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of women experience non-consensual sexual encounter at some point in their sort of university years. From what we can tell from the research, universities are particularly dangerous spaces for sexual assault, more so than other social locations. And the hookup culture hasn't seemed to change those rates of sexual assault one way or the other very much. It's very difficult to measure this accurately, though, and so those are just the best guesses of people who are looking closely at this problem, I should say. Hookup culture, of course, rests on the back of new technologies. There's always a new app. There's always a new way that people are communicating. Apps like Tinder, but also kind of non-hookup apps like Snapchat are important to people communicating with each other to create hookup opportunities. And it's an open question how students manage online and in-person interactions to meet compatible people and to manage risk. My PhD student, Nicole Anderjack, is studying this directly for her dissertation research, and so I think that we'll have some really interesting findings on this within a year or two, so keep your eye on the Sociology of Sexualities articles that come out soon. Next topic on schools, work, and sexuality is a question of how sexuality intersects with the workplace and whether it especially affects our earnings and produces an inequality of earnings. There's been some really interesting research on this topic lately, that shows us how LGBT identity and gender intersect to affect how much money we make. And so this is a very interesting study by two Canadian researchers, Sean Waite and Nicole Denyer. Dr. Waite is at Western University and Dr. Denyer is at University of Alberta. And in 2015, they published a study that shows that there is a hierarchy of earnings that places heterosexual men at the top. They earn the most. And then gay men have a wage penalty, an earnings penalty relative to heterosexual men, but that both of these groups earn more than women. And that women's hierarchy goes in a slightly different direction. Lesbian women earn more, not as much as gay men, but they earn more than heterosexual women. And so Waite and Denyer argue that sexual orientation is nested within gender to create an earnings hierarchy that privileges both masculinity, right, and heterosexuality in this very interesting way. So the closer you are to the ideal of the heterosexual masculine ideal, heterosexual men earn the most, and then we see gay men that might not reach that sort of hierarchical social norm being next. Lesbian women may have the benefit of being less tied to heterosexual men than heterosexual women are, which seems to have a dampening effect on women's earnings. I should point out that this is restricted to people who are in marital and common law relationships only. So this is for partnered same-sex couples and partnered opposite-sex couples. Here's a table that I'd like to share with you, and I know that undergraduate students love to see tables of data, so let me just walk you through this a little one step at a time, right? So the first thing I want to draw your attention to are these coefficients that I've highlighted here. They show that each of these groups, gay men, lesbian and women, and heterosexual women, have an earnings disadvantage relative to heterosexual men. So you can see this by noticing that there's a minus in front of each of these coefficients, which means that on average, the group of gay men has a negative earnings relative to heterosexual men. And then the strength of that negative relationship is associated with the size of the coefficient, right? And so gay men have a little penalty. It's a bit larger of a penalty for lesbian and women, and the largest penalty is for heterosexual women. Those three asterisks that are behind each of those coefficients, as you'll see in the note below, means that this is a statistically significant finding. So I know those of you who have had your statistics class will know what this means, but basically it means that this is something that is a reliable finding that's not likely to be due to chance of the sampling. I want to draw your attention next to this other set of information that shows that lesbian women relative to heterosexual women have a small bonus, right? So you see this is a positive coefficient relative to heterosexual women. So these earnings gaps exist on average. Of course, any individual might be different in terms of earnings, but as a group, this is the reality in Canada today. But there is also within this article also kind of a policy implication here. So you'll see that those coefficients that I just showed you last were earnings in the private sector, right? So corporations that are kind of for-profit corporations for people who work in that kind of job. But notice that the public sector employees, so people who work for the government in different capacities, right? This would include like all teachers and educational workers. It would include your professors here at university. It would include everybody in the part of the healthcare system that is a government-run healthcare system, so all your doctors. It would include everybody covered for all government jobs. You'll see that the kind of rules that have been put into place and the kind of negotiated policy enforcements of equality that the public sector unions have been able to incorporate into their collective agreements have really dampened the inequalities between these groups. Right? So although there's some inequality that remains, and you'll see that there's some significant inequality between lesbian women and heterosexual men, between heterosexual women and heterosexual men, but the scope of the differences is smaller. And the difference between gay men who work in the public sector and heterosexual men who work in the public sector is insignificant and almost zero, so just about the same. So this is kind of a policy solution that shows that the kind of structures that are in place in the public sector dampen earnings inequality in a way that private sector does not. These are interesting contemporary findings about sexuality and inequality in the workplace that I thought you'd want to see. And then our final topic that we're touching on today is the issue of sexual harassment. Of course, this is a hot topic today. It's been in the news a lot lately, and there seems to be a sort of new seriousness that people are addressing the problems of sexual harassment in the workplace in a way that they hadn't previously. Of course, sexual harassment is not that old of a concept. In fact, it was defined as a social problem only since the 1970s, where second-wave feminists who were entering the labor force in large numbers defined this as a social problem that was holding back women on the job. Right? The idea is that by sexualizing the workplace, that powerful men, mostly bosses, were marginalizing women and excluding them and making it difficult for them to succeed in the workplace and to enjoy a harassment-free work. So it started out as a very gender-specific kind of understanding. Sexual harassment on the workplace is something that men do to women. But as sexual harassment policy developed and sort of rules against it became embedded into human resources policies of all kinds of organizations, and of course in Canada now there's laws that require all workplaces to have policies against sexual harassment in place. These policies now are more gender neutral, and it covers any workplace sexualization that makes a worker uncomfortable, regardless of gender, of the perpetrator or of the target. You might be wondering how much harassment is in place here in Canada, and so we have some data on this from 2014. This is some polling data from the Angus Reid Institute that shows that that if you look at Canadians in general, about 28% of them have been subject to sexual harassment or in their workplace. About 14% have experienced unwanted sexual contact in their workplace. But this is still a very gendered phenomenon, as you could see from the next two sets of bars. Women are much more likely than men to experience both sexual harassment and unwanted physical contact in their workplace or at a work function. A full 1 in 5 women report having experienced unwanted physical touching in their workplace, and almost half, 43% of women experience sexual harassment of some kind. Men are not free of sexual harassment in the workplace. You'll see that 12% and 9% of them report sexual harassment and unwanted contact. And so this is something that happens to men as well as women, but it's much more likely to affect women than men. The hashtag #MeToo has gotten a lot of attention ever since some very high-profile cases made their way through the media in 2016, 17, 18, I think is the era we're talking about here. It shows that sexual harassment is still a way that sexuality is used for a tool of domination and gender discrimination. Right, the idea that this new kind of awareness of sexual harassment that the hashtag #MeToo embodies was meant to be a cultural shift that sort of changed the rules of the game and made sexual harassment kind of not okay. But I think it's a really open question as to whether this cultural shift really made a difference in terms of people's experiences of their own workplace. And we won't really know for a while until we can sort of redo those polls over time to see if the kinds of cultural awareness resulted in a reduction in the incidence of sexual harassment. Okay, that's all I have for you for this week. If you will kindly complete Module 7, read all the readings that you have to do, and then ace the weekly quiz, you're going to be all set for this week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week for Module 8.